Fort York was built to defend Toronto from our dastardly neighbors to the south. It would participate in two major battles throughout its history. It lost the first one when the Americans captured York during the War of 1812, but it won the second battle, which was a decades-long fight against the developers and city planners who wanted to demolish it. This week on Muddy York, we tell the story of Fort York, the guardian of Toronto Bay.
Before we talk about the fort, we should talk about what it's been called. For the sake of simplicity, we're going to call it Fort York. But it didn't always have that name. When the first fortifications were built, people called it the garrison at York or the fort at York. When new fortifications were built in the 1840s, the site that we know as Fort York became known as the Old Fort. By the 1870s, people were starting to refer to it as Fort York. However, that didn't become its official name until 1934 when it became a historical museum called Old Fort York. Like I said, to avoid confusion, we're just going to call it Fort York. Fort York is closely tied to the creation of Toronto in 1793. During the 1790s, there was a major war scare between the United States and the British Empire that ruled Canada. At the time, the main British naval base on Lake Ontario was at Kingston, but John Graves Simcoe, the Lieutenant Governor of Upper Canada, worried that Kingston was too close to the American border. He wanted to build a new naval base on Toronto Bay. Providing supplies for this base was one of the reasons that he founded the new town of York. The main fortifications would be built at Gibraltar Point on the island, but another fort was supposed to be built on the mainland. This is the site we know as Fort York. It would protect the entrance to the harbor and defend against land attacks if American troops landed to the west, which is exactly what they would do 20 years later. The only problem was that the Governor General rejected Simcoe's plan. He said it was too expensive, and without support from the British government, Simcoe had to pay for everything with the taxes revenue from Upper Canada, which wasn't very much.
Fort York was built on a triangular piece of land that was naturally defensible because it had Lake Ontario to the south and Garrison Creek to the northeast, so it could only be approached from the west. Today, decades of landfill mean that Garrison Creek is long gone, and Fort York is hundreds of meters from the water's edge. But in the 1790s, it was right on the lakeshore. During its first year, the Queen's Rangers would build 28-log building. Artillery was hard to come by, so Simcoe had to scrounge together a motley collection of antique cannon. And when I say antique, I mean that one of them was more than 130 years old. In 1796, a Mississauga chief and his wife were killed in York as part of a personal dispute with a British soldier. This led to the threat of war with the Mississaugas, and several blockhouses were hurriedly built to protect York in case of attack. Blockhouses were rectangular buildings with heavy construction to protect troops from projectiles. They also had narrow openings called loopholes through which muskets could be fired. Now, war was averted in this case, but as a result of this scare, Fort York was finally declared an official army post, meaning that the British Army would spend money to improve it. This was important because Simcoe's original buildings had already started to rot. When the War of 1812 began, Fort York had a 2-story blockhouse, along with 20 wooden cabins that were used as barracks, hospitals, and canteens, a guardhouse, a gunpowder magazine, a carriage shed, and a provision storehouse. A heavy wooden fence called a stockade was built to protect the fort. An amateur painter with the excellent name of Sempronius Stretton actually painted a watercolor of Fort York as it looked in 1804, and you can find this painting on our Twitter and Facebook pages.
That is quite the name. Sempronius Stretton? Okay. Well, the War of 1812 is the only time when Fort York came under military attack. We have a whole episode devoted to the Battle of York, so we'll only cover the basics here. The British knew that York didn't have enough fortifications, but local commanders had limited resources. We also know that they didn't have enough cannons because they were still using some of the guns that Simcoe had first brought 20 years earlier. When the Americans arrived in April of 1813, the British forces were forced to retreat, largely because the Americans outnumbered them 2-1 and outgunned them 7-1. After occupying the town, the Americans burned every building in Fort York. The British began rebuilding in August, and within 6 months, 2 new blockhouses had been erected. Today, they're known as Blockhouses 1 and 2, and they're the oldest buildings in the fort. The forest around Fort York was cut down to deny any attackers any cover, and the wood would be used to build and rebuild the fort. After all of this, effort would pay off in 1814 when an American ship tried to enter the bay. The rebuilt batteries opened fire and the Americans withdrew out of range. After 3 days of waiting, the Americans decided not to challenge the rebuilt Fort York and withdrew without a fight.
During this period, Fort York had 18 wooden buildings, 7 soldiers' barracks, 3 officers' quarters, 2 blockhouses, 2 magazines, a guardhouse, a cookhouse, and an engineer's workshop. Most of the current buildings in Fort York date from this period. They were surrounded by earthen walls to protect them from cannon fire and a wooden palisade fence to defend against infantry. The fort also had stables, a hospital, a blacksmith shop, and storehouses, but these were located outside the walls along Front Street.
Wait, putting a hospital outside the fort kind of seems like a bad idea, no?
Yeah, I wondered about that, but luckily it never came back to bite them. Once the war had ended, Fort York would become part of the great Canadian tradition of spending money on the army during a crisis, allowing it to decay once the crisis had passed, and then frantically spending more money when the next crisis hit. The first crisis was the Rebellion of 1837. Now, Fort York only played an indirect role in this conflict. In fact, one of the things that prompted William Lyon Mackenzie to launch his rebellion was the fact that the lieutenant governor had sent all but 8 members of the garrison at Fort York to fight the rebellion in Lower Canada, better known to us as Quebec. Mackenzie saw this as an opportunity to seize Toronto and to arm his men with the supplies at Fort York. However, his men were defeated at Montgomery's Tavern north of the city, and he never got close to the fort. Mackenzie's forces were so disorganized that it's possible that 8 men could have been enough to defend Fort York against them.
The government built a slew of new fortifications after the rebellion. One notable change was that these fortifications were not directed entirely at defending Toronto from a foreign attack. They were also built to defend against a second rebellion. The biggest new addition was the construction of the new fort. There was a general agreement that the wooden barracks at Fort York were inadequate. Previous requests for new buildings had been rejected as too expensive, but after the rebellion, the government agreed to build new stone barracks further west on the current grounds of the CNE. It paid for this project by selling a 1,000-acre plot of land that covered everything from the lake to Queen Street between Dufferin and Spadina. Just imagine how much that land would be worth today. Oh my gosh. Despite being called the new fort, the only fortification was an 8-foot-high wooden stockade fence. It had 2 private barracks with enough room for 300 soldiers, an officer's barrack that included a wine cellar and servants' quarters, a hospital, this time inside the fort, stables, a gunpowder magazine, and a canteen, all organized around a parade square. In 1893, the new fort would be renamed the Stanley Barracks in honor of Governor General Lord Stanley of Preston. These barracks are by far the most famous thing ever to bear Stanley's name.
Toronto was considered a desirable posting for British soldiers at the time. One officer wrote, "When we walk through its streets and see its handsome stores filled with choice goods from Europe and the States, and observe the business air of the well-dressed inhabitants, the good horses and vehicles moving actively about, we cannot be surprised to hear that property has increased enormously in value here and that labor is in great request." That's my British accent. I'm sticking to it. I don't care what you say. British officers usually came from upper or middle-class backgrounds, and they played a significant role in Toronto society. They hosted major events like balls and sleigh parties. They were also popular with local families, who saw them as prime marriage candidates for unmarried daughters. Just think of Jane Austen, and any unmarried man must be in want of a wife. But marriages between soldiers and locals were usually discouraged because the local families didn't have enough money or a high enough social standing to support a career in the British Army. One officer wrote that while he appreciated the lack of prudery in Canadian ladies, you can interpret that how you like, he worried that some of them were, quote, baits laid to catch unwary soldiers. For years, one of Fort York's most important acts was the noon gun, fired by the fort that was used to set clocks all over the city. This was the 19th century version of the time signal that CBC radio used to broadcast. The only problem was that the sundial used to measure time had actually been wrecked by a cow in 1825. So from then on, the noon gun was just fired by guesswork.
That's like the most Canadian thing I've ever heard. By 1854, Britain actually withdrew all of its troops from York to fight in the Crimean War. For the next 2 years, Toronto was defended by 150 enrolled pensioners, retired soldiers who received a land grant in exchange for sporadic military service. As you may have guessed, Britain didn't see Canada as a military priority anymore. They had also concluded that everything west of Montreal would be indefensible in the event of another war with the United States. So, in 1871, the British Army officially withdrew from Toronto and handed over the fortifications to the federal government. Detachments of the newly created Canadian militia would move into Stanley Barracks the following year. It would also be used to train the very first recruits for the Northwest Mounted Police, better known today as the RCMP. Over the next 20 years, it would become home to detachments of the Royal Canadian Dragoons and the Royal Canadian Regiment. However, as Toronto grew, the rifle ranges became a problem because the bullets would occasionally hit passing boats on the lake. One local said that it was the military's duty to warn, quote, persons who did not know any better than to live in the west end of the city that it would be more comfortable if they wore armor, and at the same time, the steamboat companies might build new line of steamers, completely ironclad with no portholes, and have the decks cleared when rounding the Dufferin Street Wharf.
Now, by the end of the 19th century, the Canadian Army recognized that Fort York and Stanley Barracks had become obsolete for the defense of Toronto, and they just used them for storage space, housing, and training. As a result, in 1903, the city bought them, along with 142 acres of the exhibition grounds. The deal allowed the Army to continue using these sites until newer facilities were built, and the city promised to, quote, properly care for and preserve Fort York. It promptly broke that agreement by allowing the Park Blackwell Packing Company to expand its slaughterhouse by demolishing the eastern part of the fort.
That sounds exactly like something that would happen in Toronto.
Hey, if you can think of a better place for a slaughterhouse, I'd like to hear it. Now, 2 years later, the city developed a plan to knock down most of the buildings in Fort York to make room for a streetcar line from Bathurst to the CNE. A teacher named Jean Yeeson, who'd been bringing her classes to Fort York for field trips, was the first person to raise public awareness about this plan. The Ontario Historical Society got involved and created the Old Fort Protective Association, convincing voters to reject the borrowing needed to pay for the streetcar line in a municipal referendum. Now at that point, City Council gracefully accepted this defeat and agreed to scrap the plan. Nah, I'm just kidding. Actually, they tried to convince Queen's Park to let them build the line anyways, but the province refused. In 1909, the federal government got involved and added several new conditions to the agreement that had transferred Fort York to the city. Among other things, it banned streetcars through the fort and required the municipal government to restore Fort York to its original condition. However, there was no deadline attached to this restoration, and it took 25 years for the city to follow through.
The impetus to restore Fort York came in the 1930s from the need to create jobs during the Great Depression. it was decided to restore Fort York to how it might have looked in 1816, partly because of the connection to the War of 1812 and partly because they had a map from that year showing the full layout of the fort. But while the city agreed to restore the buildings built before 1816, it also decided to demolish anything newer. Of the 8 historical buildings currently standing in Fort York, 7 were built during or following the War of 1812. The last one, the Blue Barracks, was dismantled and rebuilt using materials from the original building. On Victoria Day, 1934, Toronto's centenary year, the Governor General officially opened Old Fort York as a historical museum. However, this wasn't the last threat to Fort York. In 1958, the Gardiner Expressway was under construction and the Metro Toronto government proposed building one of the support piers right inside the fort. When Queen's Park blocked the plan, Metro announced their intention to tear down Fort York and rebuild it closer to the waterfront. They would ultimately back down because of public opposition, and the path of the Gardiner was shifted south of the fort. As for Stanley Barracks, they were too small to be useful during the World Wars, so in both cases, the Army wound up taking over the entire exhibition grounds. The Army left Stanley Barracks after World War II. Initially, the buildings were converted into housing to meet a post-war housing shortage. However, once the shortage had passed, the city demolished most of the buildings to make room for CNE parking. The officers' quarters was the only building to survive. Today, you can find it next to the Hotel X Toronto on the exhibition grounds. However, you can't go inside because it's been vacant for 25 years.
In 1973, the city named Old Fort York as a heritage property, and in 1985, the entire area was designated as the Fort York Heritage Conservation District. Today, it's one of the 10 history museums owned and operated by the city. Now, as you would expect, it played a big role in the commemorations for the bicentennial of the War of 1812. But alongside the historical programming that you'd expect, Fort York has also hosted a Luminato exhibition, a concert by the Replacements, and the archery competition for the Invictus Games. My favorite display there is a model of Fort York and its surroundings at the end of the War of 1812. A high school student named Sheila Wary created it for a school project in 1934, and it's been on display at Fort York ever since. And that, my friends, is the story of Toronto's very own fort. Only one major battle, but it's part of the city, and, the whole area is now known as Fort York. That's the neighborhood.
Well, guys, that's it for the episode. Thank you so much for tuning in. Adam, where can they find it?
Okay, so if you want to email us, you can email us at muddy_york@outlook.com. You can find us on Twitter at Toronto_history, or you can find us on Facebook at Muddy York History, all one word. We did try to get a consistent name for all of those, but some of them were taken, so you take what you can get.
Guys, thank you so much, and be sure to share this with a friend, anybody in your family that might like Toronto history. Always share it. Please leave and write a review. If you actually write a review, it helps push the podcast even further. So give us 5 stars, write a review. Thank you so much for your time, and we will see you soon.
I feel like we loosened up there a bit as we got going. Or at least I did.